There is a patch of grass in your backyard, maybe 8 feet wide, sitting less than 20 feet from another patch of grass that looks exactly the same to you. Same seed, same mower, same sun. And yet one of them is, for a tick, uninhabitable. Not sprayed, not treated, not touched by anything you did on purpose. The tick that wanders onto it from the tree line will be dead of thirst within hours, and it will have died surrounded by grass that looks, to every human eye that has ever looked at it, like grass. This is not a mystery that pest control companies are hiding from you. It is not a secret formula in the spray they will not tell you about. It is something stranger, and in some ways more useful than that. It is a war being fought at ankle height, in a zone maybe 6 inches deep, between a creature with almost no ability to control its own body and an environment that is, in fact, brutally specific about who gets to survive in it. Understanding that war means understanding why the tick disappeared from one corner of your yard, and it means understanding something that most people, including a fair number of people selling pest control, never quite explain, which is that the tick was never actually killed by anything. It just couldn't breathe there. And once you understand why, you will never look at a patch of lawn the same way again. If this helped, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from today. Start with the thing almost nobody knows about ticks, the fact that makes everything else in this story make sense. A tick is, biologically speaking, closer to a plastic bag with legs than it is to an insect with a real respiratory system. It does not drink water the way you'd expect an animal to drink water. It has no mouth built for sipping from puddles or dew. What it has instead is a pair of specialized glands near its mouth that can pull water vapor directly out of humid air and condense it onto its body, a trick that sounds almost like a magic power until you realize what it actually means. Below a certain humidity threshold, that trick stops working, and the tick starts losing water it cannot replace. This is called desiccation, and for a tick, desiccation is not a slow decline. It is a countdown. A tick sitting in air that's 70% humidity can survive for weeks between meals, waiting patiently in the leaf litter for a deer or a mouse or your ankle to wander close enough. Drop that humidity to 40%. The kind of dry you get on an open, sun-baked lawn in the middle of a July afternoon, and the same tick can die in a matter of hours. Not days, hours. This single fact, this one piece of tick physiology, is the hidden hand behind almost every pattern of tick presence and tick absence that homeowners notice and can't explain. It is why the tick population in your yard is not a uniform cloud settling evenly over every blade of grass. It is a map, drawn in humidity, and most of that map was drawn long before you ever called anyone about it. So picture the yard now, not as a single object, but as a patchwork of tiny, radically different microclimates stacked next to each other like a quilt. The corner near the tree line, where oak leaves pile up every fall and never quite get raked, holds moisture the way a sponge does. The soil underneath stays cool and damp well into a dry summer because the leaf litter above it acts as insulation, slowing evaporation, blocking direct sun, trapping the humidity released by decomposing organic matter. That corner might sit at 60, 70, even 80% relative humidity at ground level on a day when the open lawn 20 feet away is baking at 35%. The open lawn gets full sun for 6, 8, 10 hours a day. The soil there heats up, the grass blades themselves are shorter, there's less structure to trap moisture near the ground, and any breeze that crosses it accelerates evaporation even further. To you, standing upright, both patches feel like a summer day. To a tick, lying in the thin layer of air, just above the soil where it spends nearly all of its life, these are two different planets. One is survivable. One is a death sentence, delivered slowly enough that the tick has time to try to leave, and fast enough that it usually can't. This is where questing behavior becomes the second half of the puzzle, because a tick doesn't hunt the way you'd picture a predator hunting. It cannot run. It cannot jump. It has no interest in chasing anything, and in fact it physically cannot chase anything, not in any meaningful sense. What a tick does instead is called questing, and it is one of the strangest, most patient hunting strategies in the entire animal kingdom. The tick climbs to the tip of a blade of grass, or the edge of a leaf, or a low branch, extends its two front legs into the open air, and waits. That's the entire strategy. It waits for something warm-blooded to brush past close enough that it can grab hold with those extended front legs and climb aboard. It has sensors on those front legs, on an organ called Haller's organ, that can detect carbon dioxide, body heat, even the vibration of footsteps, and it uses those signals to decide when the moment is right to extend its legs and gamble. But here's the catch that most people never think about. Questing is expensive. Every minute a tick spends up on that blade of grass, extended into open air, is a minute it is not tucked down in the humid safety of the leaf litter. It is a minute of active water loss. So a tick that quests in a dry environment is making a bet it usually loses twice over. First, it's unlikely to catch anything, and second, it's slowly cooking off its own moisture reserves the entire time it waits. Ticks in genuinely dry, sun-exposed turf tend to quest less, retreat lower, stay closer to whatever thin margin of humidity they can find, and if that margin doesn't exist at all, they simply don't survive long enough to be a problem you ever notice. The ones in humid, shaded, leaf-littered edges quest constantly, boldly, at exactly the height where a deer's leg or a dog's belly or your calf is going to brush past. This is why the classic advice about ticks, stay in the middle of the trail, avoid the tall grass at the edges, isn't some vague caution. It's a humidity map translated into hiking advice. Now here's the part that actually explains the specific thing you're seeing, the vanishing corner, because it's not usually the shaded, humid corner that goes quiet. It's the opposite. Homeowners tend to notice that ticks seem to have disappeared from the sunnier, more open section of the yard, while remaining thick as ever along the wood line or under the hedge, and they assume something must have happened there, some treatment, some change, when in reality nothing needed to happen at all. That section was probably never truly infested in the way people imagine. What was happening instead was a slow, constant one-way migration of doomed ticks. Ticks don't respect property lines or the mental map you have of the yard as one contiguous space. They get carried in on a rabbit, a raccoon, a stray cat, cutting across the open grass to get from one shaded area to another, and they drop off along the way. Some land in the open sun, and the open sun is where they die, not instantly, but within the day, sometimes within hours if conditions are dry enough. So what looks like a corner that lost its ticks was often a corner that was only ever receiving refugees from somewhere else, refugees that were never going to make it, regardless of what you did or didn't spray. Meanwhile, the actual population, the one that's reproducing, laying eggs, and persisting season over season, was never in that open corner to begin with. It was tucked into the leaf litter at the shaded edge the entire time, invisible to you, because that's exactly the strategy that's kept it alive. This is also where the seasonal life cycle adds a layer that makes the pattern look even more like it's coming and going, when really, it's just a different life stage occupying a different structural niche. A tick goes through 4 stages in its life: egg, larva, nymph, and adult. And each of those stages has different tolerances and different behaviors. The larvae, freshly hatched, are tiny and extremely vulnerable to drying out. They stay buried deep in leaf litter and rarely quest more than an inch or two off the ground, sticking to the most humid microhabitat available. Nymphs, the stage responsible for most human tick-borne disease transmission because they're small enough to go unnoticed and have already had one blood meal to pick up pathogens from, are a bit hardier and will quest a little higher, sometimes 6 to 12 inches up a blade of grass. Adults are the toughest of the bunch and the most visible, questing up to 2 or 3 feet high on shrubs and tall grass, waiting for a larger host like a deer. So across a single season, the same patch of yard can seem to shift populations entirely, not because ticks are moving in some coordinated way, but because you're watching different generations at different life stages with different tolerances play out across the calendar. A corner that had visible adult ticks questing on tall stems in May can look cleared out by August simply because that generation has finished questing, fed, and dropped off to lay eggs elsewhere, while the next generation's larvae are down in the leaf litter where you'd never spot them anyway. It looks like disappearance. It's actually just biology, moving through its stages on a schedule that has nothing to do with anything a homeowner did. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a practical tip like this. There's a fourth piece here that almost never gets explained clearly, and it involves the animals you don't see rather than the ticks you do. Ticks don't spontaneously generate in your yard. Every tick population is downstream of a host population, and the host population that matters most is usually rodents, specifically white-footed mice, and similar small mammals that serve as the primary reservoir for the bacteria that cause Lyme disease and several other tick-borne illnesses. Mice like structure. They like brush piles, stone walls, wood piles, dense ground cover, the exact same humid, sheltered microhabitats that ticks themselves prefer, for the same underlying reason: cover from predators, moderated temperature, retained moisture. An open, closely mowed, sun-exposed lawn is close to the worst possible habitat for a mouse. It offers no cover from hawks, no shade, no proximity to food sources like acorns or seed heads. Mice avoid it structurally, not out of some elaborate awareness of tick ecology, but because it's simply bad habitat for a small prey animal trying to survive predation. And where the mice don't go, the ticks that depend on those mice for their blood meals and their pathogen reservoirs don't establish either. So the vanishing corner is very often explained by something that has nothing to do with the ticks at all, and everything to do with the mice, chipmunks, and voles that were never using that section of yard as habitat in the first place. Because open, sunny lawn is exactly the kind of terrain those animals are evolutionarily wired to avoid. There's also a fifth factor worth sitting with, because it explains why two houses on the same street, with what looks like identical landscaping, can have wildly different tick pressure, and it has to do with deer movement rather than anything happening in the yard itself. Deer are the preferred host for adult ticks of several species, and deer don't wander randomly. They follow established paths, worn down over years, that connect bedding areas to food sources, usually skirting the edges of properties rather than crossing open lawns in the middle, because deer, like mice, are prey animals that instinctively favor cover over exposure. A yard that happens to sit along one of these established deer corridors, even a corridor that's barely visible to a person, a faint break in the underbrush, a slightly worn strip along a fence line, will see a steady resupply of adult ticks dropped off by every deer that passes through, season after season, regardless of what's done to the yard itself. A yard 50 feet away that isn't on that path, that sits on the far side of a slope or a driveway that deer tend to avoid crossing, simply doesn't get that resupply, and its tick population, lacking new arrivals, stays thin no matter how similar the vegetation looks. This is one of the more frustrating truths for anyone trying to explain tick patterns to a neighbor. Two yards can be landscaped identically and treated identically and still diverge completely, because the actual determining factor was a game trail that predates both houses and that neither owner had any hand in creating. Put these 5 things together: the desiccation threshold, questing behavior tied to moisture, the life stage turnover across a season, the host animal habitat preference, and the deer corridor effect, and you get a yard that looks, on paper, like it should have an even distribution of ticks, and in practice has almost none of them in the open middle and dense, reliable populations in a 6-inch band along every wooded or brushy edge. This is such a consistent pattern across different climates and different tick species that entomologists have a specific name for it: the edge effect. It shows up in studies of black-legged ticks in the Northeast, lone star ticks across the South, even different tick species entirely in Europe and Australia, because the underlying mechanism isn't specific to any one species. It's a mechanism built into the basic physics of moisture and shade. Wherever a forest meets a lawn, wherever a hedge meets an open field, wherever a stone wall creates a strip of shaded, humid, structurally complex habitat next to open exposed ground, you get this same signature, a thin, dense band of tick activity right at the transition, and a rapid, sharp fall-off as you move away from it in either direction, especially toward open sun. So when someone notices that ticks seem to have vanished from one section of the yard, what they're usually actually noticing, without the vocabulary to describe it, is that they've crossed one of these invisible boundaries. Maybe a section of yard got a little sunnier over a few years because a tree came down in a storm and opened up the canopy. Maybe a drainage change dried out a low spot that used to stay damp. Maybe a new fence changed the wind pattern enough to speed up evaporation in one corner. Maybe a neighbor cleared brush on their side of the property line and, without meaning to, eliminated the shaded bridge that used to connect two humid pockets, cutting off a root ticks and their hosts had been quietly using for years. None of these things look like tick control from the outside. None of them involve a spray truck or a granular treatment or anything that shows up on an invoice. But every one of them can shift a patch of yard across the threshold that determines whether a tick can survive there for 6 hours or 6 weeks, and that threshold, more than anything a pest control company sprays on, determines where ticks actually persist. This matters beyond being a fun piece of trivia, because it means the advice that actually works for reducing tick exposure around a home looks less like spraying the whole yard uniformly and more like managing the edges specifically. Removing leaf litter from the border between lawn and woods, widening the mowed strip along that border by even a few feet, moving wood piles and stone features away from the areas where people and pets actually walk, keeping grass short, specifically in the transition zones, rather than treating the whole lawn as one undifferentiated space. These interventions target the actual mechanism. They change the humidity and the structure of the exact narrow band where ticks are surviving, rather than blanketing an area that was mostly already inhospitable to them to begin with. Public health researchers who study residential tick exposure have found, consistently, that a 3-foot-wide wood chip or gravel barrier at the lawn-to-woods transition measurably reduces tick presence in the adjoining lawn, not because the barrier is toxic to ticks, but because wood chips and gravel dry out fast and hold none of the moisture that leaf litter does, turning what used to be a survivable bridge zone into another stretch of desiccating no man's land the tick can't safely cross. This is also why homeowners sometimes feel like a spray treatment worked, when really, the treatment happened to coincide with a dry spell, or a mowing that widened the sunny buffer, or simply the natural seasonal drop-off as one generation of questing ticks finished its cycle. It's easy to credit the thing you paid for. It's much harder to notice the 6-inch shift in a leaf pile, or the extra hour of afternoon sun a section of yard started getting after a neighbor trimmed a tree, even though that shift is very often doing more of the actual work. None of this means chemical treatments don't do anything. They can meaningfully knock down a population in the short term, but it does mean that a treatment applied once and never repeated, on a yard whose underlying humidity and structure haven't changed, is fighting against a habitat that will simply refill itself from the edge the following season, because the mice are still there, the leaf litter is still there, and the deer path hasn't moved. None of this is a secret pest control companies are withholding, and none of it requires any conspiracy to explain. It's simply that the explanation lives at a scale most people never think to look at, inches above the soil, in the invisible humidity gradient between one patch of ground and another, in the difference between a leaf-littered edge that holds moisture like a sponge and an open lawn that dries out in the afternoon sun. Ticks are not clever. They are not adaptable in any sophisticated sense. They are small, fragile, moisture-dependent animals, executing an ancient, rigid survival strategy that only works within an extremely narrow humidity window, and everything about where you do and don't find them, including that one corner of your yard where they seem to have simply stopped existing, falls out of that one hard biological constraint. The tick didn't leave. It was never really there to begin with, not in any lasting sense. It was only ever passing through, on its way to somewhere it could actually breathe. And the corner where it finally stopped showing up isn't the corner where something was done right. It's the corner that was, from the very beginning, just a little too dry, a little too sunny, a little too far from the mice and the leaf litter and the deer path, for anything with a body built entirely around holding on to water to survive there for very long at all. Thank you for watching. More videos are on your screen now. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one.